The world, if one were to look at it from the highest balcony of the obsidian tower, was a vast, undulating blanket of ink, stitched at the edges with a silver thread of foam. To Alistair, the world was smaller than that. It was precisely 42 paces in diameter, the exact width of the small rocky islet he called home. Alistair was a man made of salt air, old wool, and patience. His beard, which had once been the color of chestnuts, had long since surrendered to the spray of the Sea of Whispers, turning a soft, weathered gray that matched the morning mist. For 40 years, he had lived at the edge of everything. For 40 years, he had climbed the 184 spiral stone steps of the Lighthouse twice a day, every day, without fail. The tower itself was an ancient thing, built from blocks of basalt so dark they seemed to swallow the starlight. It was known as the Oona Light, named after a saint who had supposedly walked across the water to save a drowning fisherman, though Alistair suspected she had simply been a very strong swimmer with a good sense of direction. The light at the summit was not powered by electricity, nor by the heavy, pungent oils of the southern whale vessels. It was fueled by a slow-burning, luminous, amber-colored peat that could only be harvested from the deep bogs of the mainland during the brief, breathless days of midsummer. Every autumn, a supply boat would brave the jagged teeth of the reef to drop off 12 heavy wooden crates of the amber peat, along with flour, dried apples, tins of salt pork, and a fresh bundle of tallow candles. Then the boat would depart, its hull shrinking into the gray horizon until it was nothing more than a speck, leaving Alistair alone with the wind, the gulls, and the rhythm of the tides. He did not mind the solitude. In truth, Alistair found the company of men to be a noisy, cluttered thing, full of sharp angles and unnecessary friction. The sea, for all its terrible strength, was honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. When it was angry, it roared and smashed against his tower. When it was weary, it sighed and stroked the dark rocks with long, cool fingers of foam. On this particular evening, the sea was very weary. Alistair stood on the gallery deck, the iron railing cold beneath his calloused palms. The air was heavy with the scent of coming frost, a crisp, clean sharpness that made the lungs ache pleasantly. The sun had set an hour prior, leaving behind a faint, bruised purple smear along the western horizon. Above him, the sky was clearing, unrolling like a scroll of dark velvet, revealing the first hesitant stars.
"A cold one tonight, old girl," Alistair murmured, tapping the iron railing with his knuckles. He often spoke to the tower. It was a harmless habit, a way to keep his voice from rusting away entirely from disuse. He turned and stepped through the low doorway into the lantern room. The air here was warm, thick with the sweet, resinous scent of the burning amber peat. The mechanism that turned the great glass lenses was a marvel of brass clockwork, a forest of gears and counterweights that ticked with a slow, hypnotic cadence. Tick, tock, click. Every 30 seconds, the heavy brass governor would release, and the great bronze carousel holding the lenses would advance 3 inches, sending a long, golden spear of light sweeping across the dark waters. Alistair knelt before the hearth of the lamp. With a small brass shovel, he lifted a single block of the peat from the iron bunker. The peat did not burn with a common red flame. It glowed from within, a deep, liquid gold that pulsed like a living heart. He slid the block into the combustion chamber, closing the heavy iron door with a satisfying, muffled clunk. "There," he said softly. "That will keep the dark at bay until the 3rd watch." He pulled a wooden stool toward the glass and sat down. From his pocket, he drew a small piece of driftwood, a fragment of cedar he had found wedged in a rock crevice 3 days ago, and a small, curved whittling knife. He began to shave the wood,
his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was not making anything in particular. He was simply letting the knife find the grain, releasing the scent of old cedar into the warm room. Outside, the world grew very still. The wind, which usually buffeted the tower with the force of a battering ram, dropped to a faint, rhythmic sigh. The waves below did not crash. They slid against the basalt base of the islet with a sound like silk drawing over silk. Tick, tock, click. The golden spear of light swept across the sea. Empty water. Tick, tock, click. The light swept again. Empty water. Tick, tock, click. On the fourth sweep, Alistair's knife stopped. He did not raise his head immediately. His eyes, trained by decades of watching the horizon for the faint, shifting shadows of rogue waves or distress flares, had caught something at the very edge of the beam. It was not a ship's mast. It was too low, too organic, too fluid. He set the cedar block and the knife on the stool and stood up, leaning his forehead against the cool, thick glass of the lantern room. He waited for the light to come around again. Tick, tock, click. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a patch of water 300 yards out. The sea was boiling, not with heat, but with movement. A long, pale shape was undulating beneath the surface, moving with an eerie, serpentine grace that defied the natural roll of the swell. It was large, larger than any whale Alistair had ever seen, and it gave off a faint, pearlescent luminescence that countered the deep blue of the ocean. Alistair felt no fear. Fear was a luxury for men who had things to lose, and Alistair had long since given his life over to the sea. Instead, he felt a profound, quiet curiosity. He watched as the shape drew nearer to the islet, moving against the tide with effortless ease. As it entered the shallower waters of the reef, the water parted. First came a long, narrow snout, white as bleached bone, with nostrils that flared to draw in the crisp night air, releasing small plumes of pale vapor that condensed instantly in the cold. Then came the eyes, vast, luminous orbs of a color Alistair could only describe as the exact shade of the moon when it rises through a winter fog, a pale, milky silver, rimmed with a thin circle of gold. The creature rose higher, its body breaking the surface without a splash, as if the water itself were honored to let it pass. It had no scales like a fish. Rather, its skin appeared to be composed of countless tiny, overlapping plates of smooth, iridescent nacre, like the inside of an abalone shell. Along its spine ran a long, delicate ridge of silver filaments that drifted in the air like the finest silk thread. It was a dragon, but it was not a creature of fire and ash, such as those spoken of in the old tales of the mountain kingdoms. This was a creature of the cold spaces, of the high, silent places, where the air is thin and the light is pure. It was a creature of the moon. The dragon swam slowly toward the base of the lighthouse, its long tail trailing behind it like a ribbon of quicksilver. When it reached the lowest ledge of rocks, the place where Alistair drew up his small rowboat, it stopped. It did not attempt to climb. It simply rested its massive, elegant chin upon the flat basalt stone, its great silver eyes fixed upward, staring directly at the lantern room. Staring directly at Alistair. The keeper stood frozen behind the glass. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic tick-tock click of the clockwork mechanism and the low hum of the burning peat. The light swept over the dragon, bathing its pale form in a warm golden glow, then plunged it back into the silver twilight of its own luminescence. The dragon did not blink. It seemed to be waiting, Alistair wiped his hands on his wool trousers. He looked at the lamp. The peat was burning steadily, the gears were well greased, and the sea was calm. There were no ships expected for weeks. "Well," the old man said to the empty room, his voice a low whisper, "it would be rude to keep a guest waiting on the porch." He turned, picked up his heavy wool cloak from the peg by the door, and began the long descent down the spiral stairs. The stone steps were cold, even through the thick leather soles of Alistair's boots. Each step echoed with a dull, hollow thud that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the tower. He did not rush. One does not rush when meeting a creature that looks as though it were carved from the frozen tears of stars. When he reached the heavy oak door at the base of the tower, he paused. He drew in a deep breath, smelling the familiar scents of damp stone, rust, and salt, and then he threw back the iron bolts. The door swung open with a low groan. The night air hit him like a physical blow, not with violence, but with a pristine, biting clarity that instantly cleared the lingering sleepiness from his brain. He stepped out onto the narrow stone slipway, his boots clicking softly against the wet rock. The dragon was there, less than 10 paces away. Up close, the creature was magnificent. It was far larger than it had seemed from the height of the lantern room. Its head alone was the size of Alistair's entire dory, and the breath that issued from its nostrils smelled of ozone, crushed ice, and the faint sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine, a smell that had no right to exist on a barren rock in the middle of a northern sea. The dragon's silver eyes tracked Alistair as he walked slowly down the slipway. There was no menace in that gaze, no animal hunger. There was only an ancient, heavy exhaustion. Alistair stopped at the water's edge, where the black swells lapped gently against his boots. He did not kneel, nor did he bow. He simply stood, a small, square man in a patched cloak, looking up into the face of a myth.
"Good evening," Alistair said, his voice steady, though it lacked its usual gruffness. The dragon let out a long, low sigh. The sound was like the wind blowing through a deep sea cave, a resonant musical hum that vibrated in Alistair's chest. The silver filaments along its spine rippled, casting tiny dancing reflections across the wet basalt. "I don't have much in the way of hospitality for someone of your size," Alistair continued, talking to the creature as he might to an old sea captain who had wandered into his parlor. "I've some salt pork, but I doubt that's to your liking. And the tea is up at the top of the tower, which is a bit of a climb for someone without legs." The dragon's eyes narrowed slightly, as if it were trying to understand the small sounds coming from the man's mouth. Slowly, with a movement so deliberate it seemed almost painful, the creature raised its head from the rock. Alistair took a half step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the iron handrail bolted into the tower wall. But the dragon did not attack. Instead, it turned its head sideways, presenting its neck to the keeper. There, just beneath the jawline, where the pale nacreous plates met the softer skin of the throat, Alistair saw a dark, jagged scar. It was not an old wound. The edges were red and angry, and from the center of the tear, a strange, dark fluid was slowly oozing. Not red blood, but a thick, midnight blue substance that shimmered with faint, dying sparks, like a handful of embers thrown into a puddle. "Ah," Alistair said, his chest softening. "So that's it. You're hurt." He stepped closer, forgetting his caution. He reached out a hand, his skin rough, scarred from old rope burns and fishhooks, and hovered it over the dragon's snout. He paused, waiting for permission. The dragon leaned its massive head down, allowing its cool, smooth skin to press against Alistair's palm. The sensation was extraordinary. It was like touching solid moonlight, or a block of ice that had been polished until it was smooth as silk, yet it was not cold enough to freeze. It was a dry, clean coolness that seemed to hum with a faint electric vibration. "Let's have a closer look at that," Alistair muttered. He moved along the creature's flank,
his boots splashing in the shallow water. He reached the wound. It was deep, likely caused by the jagged edge of an iron harpoon from one of the deep-sea whalers, or perhaps by a sharp shelf of rock during a storm. The dark blue fluid was sluggish, but it was draining the creature's light. Alistair could see that the luminescence around the wound was dim, turning a dull, muddy gray. "Hold still now," Alistair said. He knew the dragon couldn't understand his words, but tone is a universal language among living things. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who had mended broken bird wings, patched leaky hulls, and sewn up his own gashes with a sailmaker's needle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his clean linen handkerchief, a luxury he kept for wiping the delicate lenses of the lamp. He dipped it into a clean pool of rainwater that had collected in a hollow of the basalt rock and began to gently bathe the edges of the wound. The dragon flinched, its great tail thrashing once in the water far behind them, sending a low wave rolling across the inlet. But it did not pull away. It let out another of those deep, musical sighs, its silver eyes closing halfway.
I know, Alistair murmured, washing away the dark, sparkling fluid. It stings like salt in a cut, but we have to get the dirt out of it if it's going to mend. As he worked, Alistair noticed something strange. The dark fluid, the dragon's blood, did not wash away like water. Where it fell into the rainwater pool, it did not mix. It floated on the surface in small, shimmering beads, like oil, casting its own faint blue light up into the old man's face. For half an hour, the lighthouse keeper worked in the silver darkness, his fingers growing numb from the cold air, his back aching from leaning over the creature's great neck. He washed the wound clean, removing a small splinter of dark, rusted iron that had been buried deep within the flesh. When the iron was removed, the dragon gave a sharp, whistling gasp, and its whole body shuddered. "There," Alistair said, holding up the piece of rust between his fingers before dropping it into the sea. "That's the devil out of it." Now that the wound was clean, however, he faced a problem. He had no bandages large enough to cover such a tear, and the salt spray would only irritate the raw skin. He needed something that would seal it, something that would protect it from the sea until the nacreous plates could grow back. He looked up at the lantern room. The golden light was still sweeping across the sky, faithful and true. The amber peat. The peat was rich in natural resins. That was why it burned so long and so brightly. When heated, those resins melted into a thick, sticky golden sap that hardened as it cooled, becoming as tough and waterproof as the finest pine pitch. "Don't go anywhere," Alistair said, patting the dragon's wet jaw. "I'll be right back." He climbed the 184 steps again, his breath coming a little faster this time, his old knees protecting the sudden exertion. In the lantern room, he didn't sit down. He took a small iron pot that he used for boiling his morning porridge, stepped to the lamp, and carefully gathered several small fragments of the unburnt amber peat from the bottom of the bunker. He placed the pot directly over the small ventilation grate at the top of the combustion chamber, where the heat was most intense. Within minutes, the sweet, heavy scent of the resin filled the room, and the fragments began to melt, turning into a thick, bubbling gold liquid that looked like liquid sunshine. Alistair wrapped a thick rag around the handle of the pot, grabbed a clean wooden spatula from his galley shelf, and began the long walk back down. When he stepped back out onto the rocks, he was relieved to see the white shape still resting by the water. The dragon had not moved, but its eyes were open, watching him with a strange, solemn intensity. "This is going to be hot," Alistair warned, stepping up to the wound, "but it will keep the water out." He dipped the wooden spatula into the molten peat resin. It had cooled slightly during his descent, turning from a watery liquid into a thick, pliable paste. Carefully, with the steady hand of a craftsman, he smeared the golden resin across the dragon's wound, smoothing it down until it formed a thick amber seal over the torn flesh. The dragon didn't flinch this time. As the warm resin touched its cold skin, a low purring sound began deep within its throat,
a sound like the rumble of a distant summer thunderstorm. The golden resin seemed to react with the creature's own luminescence. Where the amber met the silver skin, a soft green light began to bloom, the colors mixing like paint on a canvas. Alistair applied the last of the paste, sealing the edges thoroughly. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his cloak, his breath rising in pale clouds around him. The wound was covered. The dark blue fluid had stopped leaking, and already the faint gray shadow around the injury was beginning to recede, replaced by the natural pearlescent glow of the dragon's skin. The creature raised its head fully now, its neck curving into a magnificent swan-like arch. It looked down at Alistair, then down at its own neck, feeling the hardened seal of the resin. Then it did something Alistair would remember for the rest of his days. It lowered its massive head until its snout was level with Alistair's chest. It opened its great jaws slightly, not in a threat, but in a delicate, precise gesture. From between its silver teeth, a small, round object rolled forward, stopping exactly at the keeper's feet. It was a stone, or rather a pearl, but it was a pearl such as no oyster could ever form. It was the size of a goose egg, perfectly spherical, and it glowed with a soft, internal silver light that did not flicker or fade. It was cold to the touch, but as Alistair picked it up, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him, as if all the weariness of his 40 years on the rock had been lifted from his shoulders in an instant. "Thank you," Alistair said softly, cradling the silver sphere in both hands. The dragon looked at him for one final, long moment. Then, with a graceful twist of its long body, it slid backward into the dark water. It did not dive immediately. It swam a slow circle around the islet, its white form visible just beneath the surface, a ring of liquid moonlight guarding the Oona Light. Then, with a faint splash that sounded like a distant bell, it vanished into the deep, leaving the sea as still and silent as it had been before. Alistair stood on the rocks until his boots were soaked through by the rising tide. In his hand, the silver pearl glowed, casting a soft, steady light upon the dark basalt. The weeks that followed the dragon's visit were the quietest Alistair could remember. Winter arrived in earnest, throwing a mantle of white frost over the dark rocks of the islet and turning the spray from the sea into delicate, jagged icicles that hung from the gallery railing like old men's beards. The supply boat would not return until spring, and Alistair was entirely alone. Yet, he did not feel the old, heavy silence that usually came with the freezing months. He had placed the dragon's pearl on the small wooden mantelpiece in his living quarters, right beside his old pewter tobacco tin and his copper kettle. The pearl did not need oil, nor peat, nor tending. Every evening, as the sun dipped beneath the waves and the dark rolled in, the sphere would begin to glow, filling the small circular room with a light so clean and soft that Alistair found he no longer needed to light his tallow candles. It was a strange light. It didn't cast sharp shadows like the fire or the lamp. Rather, it seemed to soften the corners of the room, making the rough-hewn stone walls look like the interior of a smooth, dry sea cave. When Alistair sat by the pearl, his joints did not ache from the winter damp, and his sleep was deep and dreamless, filled only with the faint, musical hum he had heard in the creature's throat. But the pearl was not the only change on the islet. The sea itself seemed to have altered its tune. The Sea of Whispers had always been an unpredictable neighbor, prone to sudden violent tantrums that threw white water all the way up to the lower windows of the tower. But now, the water around the islet remained remarkably calm. Even when the great northern gales blew through the channel, whipping the open ocean into a frenzy of gray waves and flying foam, the water within a 300-yard circle of the Oona Light stayed smooth as a mill pond. The fishermen from the mainland town of Oakhaven noticed it first.
From his high balcony, Alistair would occasionally see their small, dark hulls skirting the edge of the calm water. They did not venture inside. They were superstitious men, cautious of things they did not understand, but they knew that if a storm caught them near the Oona Light, they could find a strange, unnatural sanctuary within the shadow of the tower. They began to call the waters around the islet the Moon's Cradle. Alistair spent his days in the usual way, though his work felt lighter now. He polished the brass gears of the clockwork, he shoveled the amber peat, he swept the stone steps. But every evening, before he lit the main lamp, he would spend an hour on the gallery deck, looking down into the water. He did not see the white dragon again during those 2 months. He did not expect to. A creature like that belonged to the vast, empty spaces of the world, not to a single rock. But he knew it was alive. Sometimes, when the night was very clear and the moon was at its full, he would look out toward the deep water and see a faint white ridge breaking the surface miles away, moving like a line of silver poetry across the dark. It was during the 3rd month of winter, in the dark heart of January, that the world changed again. The day began with a sky the color of old lead. The wind had died down completely, leaving an eerie, breathless silence that made Alistair's ears ring. The barometer in his sitting room had dropped lower than he had ever seen it, the small silver needle pointing toward the red mark that signaled a major tempest. "A bad one coming, old girl," Alistair said to the tower as he checked the peat bunkers, "the kind that tears the shingles off the roofs and makes the whales dive deep." By mid-afternoon, the horizon had vanished, swallowed by a thick, bruised wall of cloud that came rolling in from the north like a mountain range on the move. The light didn't fade, it was simply extinguished, replaced with a twilight that smelled of sulfur and snow. Alistair didn't wait for sunset. He climbed to the lantern room at 4 o'clock and lit the peat lamp. The golden beam sprang to life, casting its long arm out into the gathering gloom. The storm hit the islet at 5. It did not begin with rain or snow, but with wind, a wind so fierce and sudden that it sounded like the roar of 1,000 great beasts running across the water. The calm circle around the tower, the Moon's Cradle, was obliterated in an instant. The waves, which had been peaceful for months, rose up like white-headed giants, throwing themselves against the basalt base of the tower with a force that made the solid stone walls tremble. Alistair stood in the center of the lantern room, his hands planted firmly on the brass carousel framework to keep his balance. Outside the glass, the world was a chaos of gray and white. The spray was so thick that the golden light from his lamp could barely penetrate more than 50 yards before being swallowed by the gloom. Then, through the roar of the wind, Alistair heard a sound that made his heart stop. It was a whistle, high, sharp, and desperate. It was the sound of a ship's steam whistle, blowing 3 short blasts in rapid succession. The signal for distress.
Alistair grabbed his brass spyglass from its leather case and rushed to the northern window, pressing his face against the glass. The glass was vibrating so hard it blurred his vision, but he wiped the condensation away with his sleeve and squinted into the storm. For several minutes, he saw nothing but the wild, rolling mountains of water. Then, the golden beam of his lamp swept north, and for a fraction of a second, the light caught a shape. It was a ship, a large 3-masted schooner, its sails torn to ribbons that whipped frantically in the gale. It was the Northern Star, the regular cargo vessel that traded between the capital and the northern ports. It had been caught by the sudden tempest before it could reach the safety of the bay, and now it was being driven mercilessly towards the jagged teeth of the outer reef, the very reef that guarded Alistair's islet. "No, no, no," Alistair muttered, his fingers tightening around the spyglass until his knuckles turned white. "Keep off, you fool! Turn her head!"
But the ship was helpless. Her rudder had either snapped or her crew had lost control of her lines. She was broadside to the waves, being lifted up on the crests of the giant swells and dropped closer and closer to the black rocks that lay hidden just beneath the foam. If she hit the reef, she would be broken into kindling within minutes, and in that freezing sea, no man could survive more than a few moments. Alistair knew what he had to do, but he also knew the limitations of his tower. The Oona Light was a fixed beacon. It swept its circle faithfully, but it could not focus its light on one spot, nor could it make itself brighter to cut through the blinding wall of spray. He looked down at the combustion chamber. The amber peat was burning at its maximum heat, the amber gold glowing with an intense, furious light. But it wasn't enough. The storm was too thick. Suddenly, Alistair thought of the mantelpiece downstairs.
He did not think, he ran. He downed the stairs 3 at a time, his old legs moving with a speed they hadn't possessed in 20 years. He burst into his sitting room, grabbed the dragon's pearl from the mantel, and ran back up the spiral stairs. By the time he reached the lantern room again, his lungs were burning and his vision was swimming with dark spots, but he did not stop. He opened the heavy iron door of the combustion chamber. The heat that hit his face was immense, scorching his beard and turning his skin red. Inside, the peat blocks were a pool of golden liquid, pulsing with power. Alistair held the silver pearl in his hands. It was perfectly cool, glowing with its own serene starlight luminescence. "If you're a thing of the sea," Alistair whispered to the stone, "help them." He reached inside the furnace and placed the silver pearl directly into the center of the molten amber peat. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The light from the lamp seemed to die down, flickering as if it were about to extinguish entirely. The lantern room plunged into a dull, smoky dimness, and outside the storm seemed to roar louder, triumphant. Then the furnace exploded, not with sound, but with light. A beam of light such as Alistair had never seen before erupted from the lenses of the Oona Light. It was not the warm golden light of the amber peat, nor was it the cold silver of the moon. It was a combination of both. A brilliant, shimmering white gold that was so pure and intense, it didn't just cut through the storm, it seemed to burn a hole right through the clouds. The beam didn't rotate. The great brass carousel gave a loud metallic screech and stopped dead, its gears locking under the sudden surge of energy. The light was focused like a solid spear, pointing directly at the northern star. The intensity of the light was so great that Alistair could see every detail of the ship's deck from 300 yards away. He saw the captain clinging to the wheel. He saw the sailors huddled by the main mast. He saw the white water breaking over her bow. The beam didn't just illuminate the ship, it did something far stranger. Where the white gold light struck the water around the vessel, the sea began to calm. The great mountain-like waves didn't break, they smoothed out, their crests sinking down as if a giant invisible hand had been laid upon the surface of the ocean. Within 100-yard lane illuminated by the light, the water became smooth as a river. The captain of the Northern Star did not waste his chance. Seeing the miraculous path of calm water opened before him, he managed to raise a small storm jib sail. The ship's head turned away from the jagged rocks of the reef, and she slid down the golden avenue of light, moving into the deeper, safer waters of the southern channel. Alistair watched through his spyglass until the schooner had passed completely through the reef and into the shelter of the mainland bay. Only then did he let out his breath, a long, ragged sob of relief. He turned back to the lamp. The furnace was quiet now. The intense white gold light had faded back to a soft silver gold glow. Alistair opened the door with his shovel and looked inside. The amber peat was gone, burned away entirely. The silver pearl was still there, but it was no longer a perfect sphere. It had melted and fused with the remaining resins, forming a beautiful, intricate crystalline structure. that looked like a tiny, glowing tree made of silver and amber glass. It was still warm, pulsing with a slow, gentle light that matched the rhythm of Alistair's own heart. The keeper sat down on his wooden stool, his body trembling with exhaustion. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but its teeth had been pulled. The ship was safe. The tower had done its work. As Alistair closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold stone wall, he heard it again. Not the wind, not the waves, but that deep, musical purr, rising up from the sea below, carrying with it the promise of spring. Spring came to the Sea of Whispers, not with a sudden burst of flowers, but with a slow, gentle softening of the air. The ice on the gallery deck melted into small, clear puddles that reflected the high white clouds, and the supply boat returned, its hull painted a bright, clean blue. The captain of the boat, a young man named Thomas, who had taken over the route from his father, looked at Alistair with a strange kind of awe as they unloaded the crates of peat onto the slipway. "They're talking about you all over the mainland, Alistair," Thomas said, setting down a crate with a heavy thud. "The crew of the Northern Star swears the Oona Light turned into a solid pillar of starfire during the January gale, said the water turned to glass right beneath their keel." Alistair shrugged his shoulders, adjusting his patched cloak. "The light behaves strangely during a northern tempest," he said gruffly. "The salt spray can play tricks on a sailor's eyes." Thomas didn't look convinced, but he knew better than to press the old keeper. Alistair was a part of the tower, and parts of towers didn't like being questioned. When the boat left, Alistair climbed back up to his lantern room. He didn't remove the silver amber crystal from the furnace. He had found that he no longer needed to burn 12 crates of peat every winter. The crystal seemed to feed upon the light of the moon itself, growing brighter during the full phases and dimming to a soft, restful glow during the dark of the month. He still climbed the 184 steps every day, but he no longer felt the weight of his years. His hands were steady, his eyes were sharp, and his mind was as calm as the wires of the moon's cradle. Years passed, like the lines of foam that form and dissolve upon the sand. Alistair grew older, his chestnut beard turning snow white, until he looked like a piece of the tower itself, carved from the sea frost. He never spoke to anyone of the dragon. It was a secret kept between the old man, the basalt stone, and the deep water. But every summer, on the anniversary of that cold November night, the sea around the islet would turn a brilliant, pearlescent white, and a long, graceful shape would swim a slow, protective circle around the Oona Light. And Alistair would stand on his balcony, his hand resting on the iron railing, looking down at his friend. They would exchange a look, the old man and the moon dragon, two guardians of the edge, keeping the dark at bay, until the tides came to carry them both home into the endless silver twilight.